For over 30 years, St. Joseph County taxed Kenneth's 80 acres as unproductive wasteland. His annual property tax bill was $112. Then, one Wednesday morning, a timber buyer offered him $65,000 for a single black walnut tree. That tree was one of hundreds. Kenneth Miller, a third-generation farmer, had watched that hardwood forest grow for 40 years while the county appraiser saw only brush. This is the story of a hidden fortune growing in plain sight, a tax bill based on a lie, and what happens when the man who knew the truth decided to prove it. Kenneth Miller bought the 80-acre woodlot in 1974 for $8,000. It was part of a larger farm sale, and the previous owner called it the back 40, times 2. Too hilly for crops, too dense for pasture, just a tangled mess of young trees and brush that hadn't been farmed in a generation. The St. Joseph County Assessor's Office classified it as Category C3 land, unimproved woodland. Their manual defined C3 as having less than 20% merchantable timber, land that was essentially non-productive. The assessed value they placed on it was $100 an acre. Kenneth's total property tax bill for the parcel was $112.16 a year. He paid it every November without thinking. He wasn't trying to hide anything. He just liked the woods. He'd walk the property with his son on weekends identifying trees: black walnut, white oak, sugar maple, black cherry. He knew they were valuable species, but he was a crop farmer. Corn and soybeans were his business. The woods were his peace. And for 25 years, the county assessor never set foot on the property. The assessment was done from the road or from an old aerial photo. Every 5 years, the assessment notice would arrive in the mail. Category C3, unimproved woodland. Value, $8,000. Tax, $112.16. Kenneth would file it and forget it. Let me tell you about the St. Joseph County Assessor's Office in the 1990s. Because the system that labeled Kenneth's forest as wasteland wasn't malicious, it was blind. The office had 3 field appraisers for the entire county. Their primary job was assessing residential and commercial property. Farmland was complicated, but they had standardized agricultural use tables. Woodland was an afterthought. The state provided guidelines for valuing forest land based on soil productivity and average timber yields, but the county didn't have a forester on staff. They had a checklist. If the land wasn't enrolled in a formal timber management program, if there wasn't a documented forest management plan on file, if the owner wasn't paying a forester for consulting, it went in the C3 category: unimproved, non-productive, wasteland. The man who signed Kenneth's assessments for most of those years was named Gary Wilcox. Gary was in his late 40s, a former insurance adjuster who'd taken the county job for the benefits. He was diligent with houses. He measured square footage, noted vinyl siding versus brick, checked for finished basements. When it came to woods, if he saw dense canopy from the road, he checked the C3 box. His rationale was simple: if the owner wasn't actively harvesting timber, it wasn't timberland. It was just trees. Gary never saw the trees themselves. He never saw the trunk diameter of the black walnuts. He never counted the number of veneer quality stems per acre. He saw a green blob on a map and assigned a value based on a category created for scrub pine and swampland. Let me tell you about what was actually growing on Kenneth's 80 acres. Because by the year 2000, the forest was no longer a tangled mess. It was a bank account. Kenneth had done subtle management without even calling it that. He'd cleared invasive brush to give the hardwood space. He'd culled diseased trees. He'd let nature do the rest. The black walnuts planted by squirrels generations ago were now between 18 and 30 inches in diameter. The cherries were straight and clear of branches for 20 feet. This wasn't just timber. This was premium veneer stock. In the hardwood market, there's a hierarchy. At the bottom is pulpwood turned into paper or chipboard. Then comes sawlogs cut into lumber for flooring or furniture. At the very top is veneer. A single perfect log is sliced into sheets thinner than paper, used for luxury automobile interiors, high-end cabinetry, and architectural panels. The value isn't measured in board feet, it's measured in dreams. A prime black walnut veneer log can sell for $10,000. A prime black cherry log can bring $6,000. And Kenneth had hundreds of trees that met the grade. But the county still saw a green blob. The tax bill was still $112. The disconnect went unnoticed until 2009. Kenneth's neighbor to the east, a man named Carl who ran a 300-acre corn and soybean operation, was complaining about his property taxes at the local diner. His assessed value was over $1 million. His tax bill was $14,000 a year. "You're lucky," Carl said to Kenneth. "All you got is that woods. County don't care about trees." Kenneth just nodded, but he started thinking. He'd seen logging trucks on the highway hauling walnut. He knew the prices weren't what they used to be. They were better. He made a call to a forestry extension agent at the state university. A polite conversation about timber values. The agent asked for the county of the property. When Kenneth said St. Joseph, the agent paused. "You're not enrolled in the Clean and Green program, are you?" he asked. "The what?" Kenneth said. "The Preferential Tax Assessment Program for Woodland. If you're not enrolled, they're probably taxing it as something else. I get a tax bill. It says unimproved woodland." The agent was quiet for a moment. "You should get a forester out there, just for a look." Kenneth hired a consulting forester named David Shaw. David walked the property for 3 hours. He used a tool called a clinometer to measure tree heights. He used a diameter tape. He carried a notebook and wrote down numbers in a tight, precise script. He didn't say much until they got back to the truck. "Mr. Miller," David said, wiping his forehead, "what has the county been assessing this land at?" Kenneth told him, $8,000 for the whole parcel. David Shaw closed his notebook slowly. "I need to sit down," he said. They sat on the tailgate. David opened his notebook. "Do you know what just the black walnut on this property is worth? Not the oak, not the cherry, not the maple, just the walnut." Kenneth shook his head. "Based on current veneer prices," David said, "and assuming a conservative 60% recovery rate on the logs, the standing walnut timber on this property is worth approximately $1.2 million. Kenneth stared at him. The number didn't make sense. It was too large to fit in the space of his 80 acres. "The cherry," David continued, "is another 400,000. The white oak, maybe 200,000. You are sitting on nearly $2 million worth of premium hardwood, and you are paying property taxes on $8,000 of wasteland." The air left Kenneth's lungs. He looked back at his woods, the same trees he'd walked past for 35 years. They hadn't changed. The world's understanding of them had just been obliterated. Why was all he could ask. "Because nobody looked," David said. "The county's assessment model is built for cornfields and houses. It doesn't have a column for 80-year-old veneer walnut, so it defaults to the lowest possible value. It's a system error, and you are the beneficiary." Kenneth drove home in a daze. $2 million in trees. He thought of Carl's 300-acre farm, assessed at $1 million. The timber on Kenneth's 80 acres was worth twice his neighbor's entire operation, and the county had no idea. For a week he told no one, not even his wife. He wrestled with a moral and practical dilemma. He could keep quiet, pay his $112 a year and let his heirs discover the fortune. Or he could do something. But doing something would trigger a reassessment. It would alert the county. It would change everything. He decided to get a second opinion, not on the value, but on the law. He made an appointment with a property tax attorney in the city. The attorney's name was Susan Carter. Her office was in a downtown building of glass and steel. She listened to Kenneth's story, looked at David Shaw's preliminary report, and then pulled up the state tax code on her computer. The law is clear, she said. Property must be assessed at its fair market value. For agricultural and timber land, that means its value in its current use, not its potential development value. The county has been assessing your land incorrectly. But and she turned the screen toward him. Here's the problem. She pointed to a subsection. If a classification error is discovered, the assessor is required to correct it, and they can issue a corrected tax bill for the current year and the 2 preceding years. You could be on the hook for 3 years of back taxes at the correct valuation. How much would that be? Kenneth asked. Susan did some quick math. If they reassess the land at, say, $10,000 an acre for the timber value, that's $800,000 assessed value. Your tax rate is about 1.4%. That's $11,200 a year. For 3 years, that's $33,600 plus possible penalties. Kenneth's stomach tightened. He had savings, but not that kind. But Susan said, leaning forward, that's if they reassess it as timberland. If they try to reassess it as something else, like residential land ready for development, the value could be $20,000 an acre. Then you're looking at over $60,000 in back taxes. So if I say nothing, I'm safe. If I try to correct their mistake, I could owe a fortune. That's one way to see it, Susan said. Another way is that you have a $2 million asset that you are insuring for $8,000. If anything happens, a fire, a tornado, the insurance company will only pay you the assessed value. You'd lose everything. Kenneth left the office more confused than ever. He was trapped. The system's mistake protected him from taxes but exposed him to catastrophic loss. To secure his asset, he had to destroy his advantage. He drove home the long way, past the county administrative building. He saw Gary Wilcox's county-issued sedan in the parking lot. He had a sudden, reckless thought. What if he didn't tell the county? What if he just harvested some timber? The tax was based on the land, not the trees. The trees were considered a crop. He could sell the crop without changing the land's classification. Couldn't he? He called David Shaw that evening and asked the question. Technically, yes, David said. The timber is a separate asset. You can sell it. But Kenneth, as soon as a logging truck loaded with walnut leaves your property and heads to the mill, the whole county is going to know. The assessor will find out. It will trigger a review. It's inevitable. Kenneth hung up. He stood at his kitchen window, looking out at the woods. The setting sun lit the canopy in gold and red, a $2 million sunset. He made his decision. He would harvest, not all of it, just a selective cut. He would take enough to prove the point, to secure his family's future, and to see the look on the county appraiser's face when he realized what he'd missed for 35 years. He called David Shaw back and gave the instructions. Mark the trees. Get bids from mills. We're cutting in the fall. The process took months. David marked 50 trees, a mix of walnut and cherry. He took core samples to check for internal defects. He contacted specialty mills in Ohio and Pennsylvania. The bids came in sealed envelopes. Kenneth opened them at his kitchen table. The first bid, for the walnut only, $280,000. The second bid, for the walnut and cherry together, $390,000. His hands shook. This was for 50 trees, less than 10% of the mature timber on the property. He accepted the second bid. The contract was signed. The harvest was scheduled for the first week of October 2010. On the morning of the harvest, Kenneth stood at the edge of the woods as the sun rose. The logging crew arrived with their skidders and a massive truck. The crew boss, a man named Randy, walked over with a clipboard. "Beautiful stand, Mr. Miller. Some of the best walnut I've seen in 20 years. You must have been managing this for decades." Kenneth just smiled. "I guess I was." The first tree to fall was a 30-inch black walnut. The chainsaw screamed through the morning air. The tree cracked, leaned, and then fell with a ground-shaking thud that echoed across the hollow. Randy walked over to the stump, then whistled. He called Kenneth over. "Look at that," he said. The stump was clean, the grain tight and straight. No defects, pure, perfect heartwood. This was a veneer log, 12 feet long, worth $15,000 by itself. Word travels fast in a small county. By noon, a county sheriff's deputy had pulled up, curious about the logging operation. Friendly, just checking. He saw the logs stacked by the road, the distinctive dark heartwood of the walnut. After he left, Kenneth's phone rang. It was a neighbor. "Hey Ken, here you're cutting timber. What are you getting for that walnut?" Kenneth gave a vague answer, but the seed was planted. The logging took 4 days. When the last truck was loaded and driven away to the mill in Pennsylvania, Kenneth had a check for $390,000 in his hand. And he had 80 acres that still, officially, were classified as unimproved woodland worth $8,000. He deposited the check on a Friday. The following Monday, a different county car pulled into his driveway. It was Gary Wilcox. It was a younger man in a crisp khaki shirt with a county badge. He introduced himself as Ben Arneson, the new chief county appraiser. He had a clipboard and a tight smile. "Mr. Miller, I understand you've conducted a timber harvest." "Yes," Kenneth said. Ben Arneson looked past him at the woods, where the gaps in the canopy were now visible. "Do you have a copy of the harvest contract and the sale price? For our records." Kenneth felt a cold trickle in his chest. He knew this was coming. He'd prepared. He went inside and got the paperwork. Ben Arneson looked at the total on the contract. His eyebrows went up. He did not smile. He made a note on his clipboard. "Thank you," he said. "We'll be in touch." He drove away. Kenneth stood in his driveway watching the dust settle. He knew what came next: the reassessment, the corrected tax bills, the end of the $112 era. But he was wrong about one thing. What came next wasn't a correction. It was a declaration of war. The letter from the St. Joseph County assessor arrived 2 weeks later. It was not a correction. It was a notice of reassessment and a tax bill for $34,711. Kenneth opened it at the kitchen table. The number didn't compute at first. He looked at the parcel number. It was his land. The classification had changed. It was no longer C3 unimproved woodland. It was now classified as T1 managed timberland. The assessed value was listed as $1,200,000. His hands went cold. He called David Shaw, the forester. "They reclassified it," David said, sounding grim. "T1 is the right classification. But that assessed value, that's not the land value. That's the land value plus the timber value. They're taxing you on the asset you just sold. They're counting the crop still in the field." "Can they do that?" Kenneth asked. "I don't know," David said, "but they just did." Kenneth called Susan Carter, the attorney. She asked him to read the entire notice over the phone. She was silent for a long moment after he finished. "They've made a fundamental error," she said. "A huge one. They've assessed the land based on the gross revenue of your timber harvest, not on the soil productivity value for growing timber. They've essentially valued your land as if it grows $390,000 worth of trees every year. That's not how it works. That's like assessing a cornfield based on 1 year's harvest and pretending that harvest happens every year." "So what do I do?" Kenneth asked. "You appeal," Susan said. "Immediately. You have 30 days from the date on that notice to file a formal appeal with the County Board of Review. And you need to get an official timber appraisal, not a consultant's estimate. A full, defensible appraisal from a certified forest appraiser." Kenneth hung up. The cost of the fight was already adding up. Attorney fees, appraisal fees. He still had the $390,000 from the harvest, but now it felt like a target on his back. He hired the appraiser, a man named Robert Gage from the state capitol. Robert spent 2 days on the property, using the same tools as David Shaw but with a different manual. His report was 40 pages long. It concluded the fair market value of the land as timberland was $45,000 an acre. For 80 acres, that was $3,600,000. Kenneth felt sick when he read it, but Robert pointed to a second number. The assessed value for tax purposes, according to the state's agricultural use formula, was $1,200 an acre, $96,000 total. The county had assessed it at $1,200,000. They were off by a factor of 12. "This is the fight," Robert said. "They're using the wrong number. They saw a big check and got dollar signs in their eyes. They're trying to tax the trees that were cut and sold, not the land's capacity to grow trees. It's predatory." Kenneth filed the appeal. The hearing was set for the first week of December. The County Board of Review was a three-person panel: a retired banker, a local real estate agent, and a farm equipment dealer. None of them were foresters. Kenneth went with Susan Carter and Robert Gage. Ben Arneson, the chief appraiser, was there for the county. He presented his case first. He put up a slide. It showed Kenneth's property. Then it showed the timber sale contract with the $390,000 total highlighted. "Our office determined," Ben said, "that the productivity of this land warranted a significant adjustment. The sale demonstrated its true income potential. The new assessment reflects that potential." Susan Carter stood up. "With all respect, Mr. Arneson, you are confusing a one-time sale of a mature crop with the annual productivity of the land. The State Assessment Manual for timberland is based on soil types and species growth rates, not on the proceeds of a harvest that occurs once every 80 years. You have illegally applied a commercial valuation method to agricultural land." Ben Arneson didn't flinch. The land produced that income. Therefore, that income is relevant to its value. "That's not the law," Susan said. She turned to the board. "We have a certified appraisal that values the land according to the state's prescribed methodology. The county's assessment is in error. We request a reduction to the correct value of $96,000. The board asked a few questions. They seemed confused by the terminology: growth yields, soil site indexes, discount rates. The real estate agent on the board kept coming back to one point. "But he did get nearly $400,000 for the trees, right? So the land must be worth more than you're saying." After an hour, the board went into closed session. They came out 20 minutes later. The chairman, the retired banker, read the decision. "The board finds that the county's assessment, while perhaps methodologically unconventional, is not clearly excessive. The appeal is denied." Kenneth was stunned. Denied just like that. Susan touched his arm. "We appealed to the state," she whispered. "This isn't over." But the tax bill was still due. $34,000. If he didn't pay it by January 31st, penalties would accrue, then liens, then foreclosure. He paid it. He wrote the check from the timber account, watching a huge chunk of his harvest vanish to pay a tax he believed was illegal. It felt like theft. Let me tell you about what happened next, because Kenneth Miller wasn't the only one watching. News of the reassessment and the denied appeal spread through the farming community. It was the talk of the co-op, the diner, the church basement. Most farmers sympathized with Kenneth. They saw the county moving the goalposts after a man finally made a profit from his land. But a few saw an opportunity. One of them was Carl, Kenneth's neighbor with the 300-acre crop farm. Carl had been complaining about his own high taxes for years. He saw Kenneth's fight and had a different thought. "If the county is suddenly valuing woods that high," he said to his wife, "what does that say about my woods?" Carl had a 30-acre woodlot of his own, also classified C3. He never given it a thought. After Kenneth's reassessment, Carl called a timber buyer out of curiosity. The buyer walked the property and offered Carl $90,000 for a select cut. Carl took the deal. He harvested, and 2 months later, he got his own reassessment notice. His 30 acres were now valued at $450,000. His tax bill went up by $6,000 a year. Carl was furious. He called Kenneth. "You started this," he said, though his anger was misdirected. "The county's coming for all of us now." He was right. The St. Joseph County Assessor's Office, under Ben Arneson, had launched a quiet project. They were reviewing every parcel in the county classified as C3 unimproved woodland that was over 10 acres. They were cross-referencing aerial photos with logging permits. They were looking for any sign of timber activity. The goal was to find every hidden woodlot and reclassify it. It was a revenue hunt. The county was facing budget shortfalls. They had found a gold mine they didn't know they owned, the mature hardwood forests of their own taxpayers. Kenneth's appeal moved to the state level, the Indiana Board of Tax Review. This was a more formal proceeding. Briefs were filed. Motions were argued. The case was scheduled for a hearing in March. In preparation, Susan Carter made a discovery. She filed a public records request for all communications within the assessor's office regarding the reassessment of Kenneth's property. The documents she received were revealing. There was an internal email from Ben Arneson to the county commissioner. Subject line: Major timber sale, opportunity for revenue correction. The email read, in part, "The Miller sale demonstrates a systemic underassessment of woodland parcels. I recommend a county-wide review to capture this lost value. We are leaving millions on the table." Another document was a memo from the county's financial advisor. It projected that reclassifying all significant woodlots could generate an additional $1.2 million in annual property tax revenue. This wasn't about correcting an error on Kenneth's land. This was about using Kenneth as the blueprint for a new county-wide tax policy. Susan had the smoking gun. The county's motivation wasn't accurate assessment. It was revenue generation. She presented this at the state hearing. The state hearing officer, a former judge, listened carefully. Ben Arneson defended his actions, again citing the timber sale as proof of value. The hearing officer interrupted him. "Mr. Arneson, if I sell the apples from my apple tree, do I then pay property tax based on the value of the apples or the value of the tree?" "It's not that simple," Ben argued. "It is that simple," the hearing officer said. "The law is clear. Timber is a crop. The land is assessed for its ability to grow that crop over time, not for the one-time sale of the crop. Your office has conflated the two. The appeal is granted." The ruling came down in April. The state board ordered St. Joseph County to rescind the reassessment and restore the T1 classification with a proper soil-based valuation. Kenneth was owed a refund for the overpaid taxes, plus interest. It was a complete victory. Kenneth had beaten the county. He called Susan Carter elated. Susan's voice was cautious. "It's a great win, Kenneth, but you need to read the full order. There's a footnote." Kenneth found it. Footnote 3. It stated that while the assessment method was flawed, the county's underlying action, reclassifying the land from C3 to T1, was upheld. The land was officially timberland now. The $112 tax bill was gone forever. The new annual tax would be based on the $96,000 value, which worked out to about $1,350 a year. Kenneth sat back. He won the battle against the outrageous tax, but he'd lost the war for the old valuation. The woods were now on the county's radar, properly categorized. His taxes would be 13 times higher than before forever. He was okay with that. It was fair. It was what should have been happening all along. He thought it was over. He was wrong again. In May, a certified letter arrived. It was not from the assessor. It was from the office of the St. Joseph County prosecutor. It was a notice of investigation. The subject line made Kenneth's blood freeze. Potential criminal complaint, property tax evasion. The letter stated that the prosecutor's office was reviewing the circumstances of his timber harvest and the prior 35 years of property tax payments. They were investigating whether Kenneth had knowingly allowed the county to underassess his property to avoid paying lawful taxes. They requested a meeting with him and his attorney. Susan Carter was furious when he read it to her. This is intimidation, Kenneth, pure and simple. They lost at the state level, so they're trying to threaten you with criminal charges. It's a bluff. Is it? Kenneth asked, his voice quiet. I don't know, Susan admitted, but we have to treat it like it's real. The meeting was in the prosecutor's office. The room was cold. Present were an assistant prosecutor named Lisa Good, Ben Arneson from the assessor's office, and a detective from the sheriff's department. Susan Carter represented Kenneth. Lisa Good opened a file. Mr. Miller, for over 3 decades, you paid taxes on land valued at $8,000. You were aware during that time that the timber on that land had significant value, were you not? I knew the trees were there, Kenneth said. I didn't know what they were worth until 2009. But you suspected, Ms. Good pressed. You're a lifelong farmer. You know the value of walnut. I know the value of a walnut board at the lumberyard, Kenneth said. I didn't know the value of a standing veneer tree. That's a specialist's knowledge. Ms. Good slid a photograph across the table. It was an aerial shot of Kenneth's property from 1998. You can see the mature canopy here, the distinct shape of hardwoods. Are you saying you couldn't see that from the ground? Susan Carter cut in. My client is not an aerial photographer. The county assessor is. The county had the same aerial photos. The duty to properly assess lies with the county, not the taxpayer. My client had no legal obligation to march into the assessor's office and demand a higher tax bill. In fact, the law protects taxpayers from retroactive penalties for exactly this scenario. Ben Arneson spoke up. He had a duty to report a change in use. When he began managing the timber, he should have notified our office. Managing? Kenneth said, his temper rising. I walked in the woods. I cleared some brush. That's not a formal management plan. You didn't have a forester on staff. You didn't have a form for me to fill out. You had a checkbox for Wasteland and you checked it for 35 years because it was easy. The meeting grew heated. The detective took notes. Lisa Good finally closed her file. We will be reviewing this matter, she said. We may convene a grand jury to consider charges of attempted evasion. A grand jury. The words hung in the air. Kenneth was no longer just fighting a tax bill. He was fighting for his freedom and his reputation. As they left the building, Susan was seething. This is outrageous. They have no case, but they can make your life a living hell for a year while they pretend to investigate. What do I do? Kenneth asked, feeling hollow. We fight, Susan said, but now we fight dirty. We take this public. The following Sunday, Kenneth Miller did something he had never done before. He stood up during the announcements at his church. He wasn't an eloquent man. He clutched the pew in front of him. Most of you know about my trouble with the county over my timber, he said, his voice shaky. What you might not know is that now the prosecutor is threatening to charge me with a crime for paying the tax bill the county sent me for 35 years. The room was utterly silent. They're saying I should have told them their paperwork was wrong. They're saying I evaded taxes by cashing their check. I'm scared. And if they can do this to me, they can do it to any of you with woods on your property. To Carl. To anyone. He sat down. The silence continued for a moment, then broke into a buzz of conversation. By that afternoon, the story was no longer about a tax reassessment. It was about a county government targeting a farmer for its own mistake. The local newspaper got wind of it. A reporter called Kenneth. The story ran on the front page the next Wednesday. The headline, Facing Felony for Paying His Tax Bill, Farmer Fights County Over Timber Wasteland. The public reaction was immediate and furious. Letters flooded the county commissioner's office. The prosecutor's office phone lines jammed. A local farmers' union offered to organize a protest. The county commissioners, facing a political firestorm, called an emergency closed session. They were caught between an aggressive assessor and prosecutor they'd empowered, and an electorate that saw itself in Kenneth's boots. Pressure built for a week. Then, a second letter arrived from the prosecutor's office. This one was brief. It stated that after a thorough review, the office had determined there was insufficient evidence to pursue criminal charges. The investigation was closed. Kenneth read it 3 times. He showed it to Susan. They folded, she said. The publicity was too hot. They couldn't risk a jury trial where they'd have to argue that you committed a crime by accepting their low assessment. You're in the clear. Kenneth felt no triumph, only exhaustion. He had spent over a year fighting and tens of thousands of dollars in legal and appraisal fees. He had won every battle. The tax was corrected to a fair amount. The criminal threat was gone. He still had most of his timber money. But he looked at the woods differently now. They were no longer just his peaceful retreat. They were a battlefield, and he knew the war had changed him. He also knew something else. The county's project, the review of every woodlot, had stalled under the bad publicity, but it hadn't been canceled. Ben Arneson was still the chief appraiser. The memo about millions left on the table was still in a file somewhere. Kenneth had survived, but the system that had tried to break him was still in place, waiting for the spotlight to turn away. He made a decision. He wouldn't let it turn away. If the county wanted to fix its broken assessment system, it would have to do it openly, fairly, and for everyone, not by making examples of farmers who dared to harvest their trees. He called Susan Carter one last time. "I want to sue them," he said. "Sue them for what?" Susan asked. "For the legal fees, for the stress, for the malicious prosecution," Kenneth said. "Maybe just to make a point that this can't happen to the next guy. Will you help me?" Susan was quiet. Then she said, "Yes, I'll help you, but Kenneth, listen to me. This will take years, it will cost more money, and even if you win, the check you get from the county will be written with taxpayer money, your neighbor's money." Kenneth understood the irony. He was quiet for a long time. "Then do it for $1, he said, "and a public statement. I want them to admit they were wrong, not just to me, to everybody." That, Susan said, might be the most expensive dollar the county ever pays. The lawsuit was filed in federal court in July. It alleged civil rights violations, malicious prosecution, and abuse of government power. It asked for $1 in damages and a court order requiring the county to reform its woodland assessment procedures. The county fought it. They filed motions to dismiss. They argued sovereign immunity. The legal process ground on, a slow, expensive machine. While the lawsuit dragged, life on the farm continued. Kenneth's son, Michael, who was in his 30s and worked the row crop land with him, had watched the whole ordeal. One evening over dinner, Michael asked a question. "Dad, after all this, would you do it again? Would you harvest the trees?" Kenneth looked out the window at the dark silhouette of the woods. "Yes," he said, "because it was mine, I grew it. They just didn't see it until I sold it. That was their fault, not mine." "But they made you pay," Michael said. "They tried," Kenneth corrected. "They didn't succeed. And now you know. You know to walk into that assessor's office with a forester's report the day you turn 21. You know to get the classification right from the start. You know to read every line of every tax notice. That's the lesson. Don't hide from them. Force them to see what's right in front of them." The lawsuit stretched into a second year. The county's legal bills were mounting. The local newspaper ran stories about the cost of the litigation. Editorials asked why the county was spending hundreds of thousands to avoid saying it was sorry to one farmer. Finally, in the fall of the second year, the county made an offer. They wanted to settle. The settlement conference was held in a judge's chambers. The county was represented by their attorney, the commissioner, and Ben Arneson. Kenneth was there with Susan. The county's offer was this. They would pay Kenneth's legal fees, totaling $128,000. They would issue a public statement that the criminal investigation had been a mistake. They would not, however, admit to any wrongdoing in the assessment process, and they would not agree to any court-ordered reforms. Kenneth listened. He looked at Ben Arneson, who wouldn't meet his eye. "No," Kenneth said. The county attorney blinked. "No, Mr. Miller, this is a significant sum." "I don't want your money for my lawyer," Kenneth said. "I already paid her. I want the $1, and I want the reforms. I want a public process where farmers and forest owners can get their land classified correctly without fear. I want an amnesty period for people to come forward. I want you to fix the system you broke." The county commissioner, a man named Doherty, leaned forward. "Mr. Miller, we can't have a court dictating our assessment policies." "Then you shouldn't have used them as a weapon," Kenneth said. The meeting ended without a deal. The judge urged both sides to think it over. As they were leaving, Ben Arneson approached Kenneth in the hallway. It was the first time he'd spoken to him directly, without lawyers, since the day he'd come to the farm after the harvest. "It was never personal, Mr. Miller," Ben said. Kenneth looked at him. "It was my land, my trees, my life. Of course it was personal." Ben nodded, looked at the floor, and walked away. A week later, the county called with a new offer. They would pay the legal fees. They would issue the apology, and they would establish a voluntary, no-penalty review program for woodland classification for a period of 2 years. They would not admit to violating anyone's rights. Susan advised him to take it. "It's the best you'll get, Kenneth. You've won. You've changed the policy. That's more than most people ever do." Kenneth agreed. The settlement was signed. The county cut the check for his legal fees. They issued a press release stating they regretted the unnecessary distress caused to Mr. Miller. The local paper ran the story with the headline, "County Settles with Farmer, Vows to Fix Woodland Tax Process." It was over, truly over. Kenneth stood at the edge of his woods one last time, at the spot where the first walnut had fallen. The gaps in the canopy had begun to fill with new growth. In 80 years, his great-grandchildren might stand here, facing the same decision. He hoped they'd have better tools. He hoped the system would be clearer. But he knew, deep down, that the value of things hidden in plain sight would always tempt those in charge of the ledger. He had forced them to look, and for now that was enough. For 6 months there was quiet. The voluntary review program began. A few dozen landowners came forward to have their woodlots reclassified. The process was smooth, bureaucratic. Kenneth thought he'd achieved something lasting. Then, in the spring, the first letter arrived from the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. It was addressed to Kenneth, but it was about his neighbor, Carl. The letter stated that the DNR had been notified by St. Joseph County of a change in land classification for parcel number listed. The parcel, Carl's 30-acre woodlot, had been changed from unimproved woodland to managed timberland. As a result, the parcel was now subject to the state's forest harvest notification law. Any future timber harvest required a notification form filed with the DNR, at least 14 days before cutting. Kenneth read it twice. It was a standard forestry regulation letter, but the mechanism triggered his alarm. The county was automatically notifying the state whenever they reclassified a property. That created a permanent paper trail, a list. He called Carl. "Did you get a letter from the DNR?" "Yeah," Carl said, sounding unconcerned. "So what? It's just a form." "It's a list, Carl," Kenneth said. "The county is building a list of every landowner with valuable timber, and they're giving it to the state. Who else are they giving it to?" "You're paranoid," Carl laughed, but the laugh was thin. Kenneth called his forester, David Shaw. David listened and was quiet for a long time. "It's a trigger," David said finally. "The DNR notification law is meant to monitor large-scale harvesting, prevent clear-cutting. But once you're on that list, Your property is flagged in half a dozen state databases. Department of Revenue for tax audits. Department of Environmental Management for runoff permits. It becomes visible, and visibility in bureaucracy always leads to more regulation or more fees. Kenneth felt the old chill. The settlement hadn't stopped the machine. It had just routed it through different channels. Let me tell you about the list, because within a year it had a name inside the county government. The timber parcel inventory. It started with the voluntary reviews, but Ben Arneson's office didn't stop there. They began using satellite imagery and AI software to identify parcels with mature hardwood canopy cover. The software could distinguish between a pine plantation and a mixed hardwood stand from space. The county was systematically hunting for black walnut from orbit. They weren't reassessing these parcels yet. They were cataloging them, building a map. The estimated merchantable timber value was listed in a column next to the owner's name. Kenneth's parcel was at the top of the list. Estimated value, $1.8 million. This map was not public. It was an internal working document. Kenneth learned about it through a new friend, a woman named Maria who worked in the county's IT department. She'd seen the file on a shared server. She heard the stories about Kenneth. She thought he should know. She met him in a parking lot and gave him a printout of the first page, 20 parcels. Total estimated timber value, $17 million. They're not assessing them, she said. They're appraising them. There's a difference. An assessment sets a value for taxation. An appraisal estimates market value for potential sale. This document uses the word appraised value. Kenneth stared at the numbers. Why would the county need to know the market value of timber they don't own? Maria looked around. There's talk, she said, lowering her voice. The county is exploring a bonding initiative for a new justice center. They need collateral. Some of the commissioners have asked if county-owned timber rights could be used as collateral, or if the county could facilitate a bulk timber sale with a share of the proceeds. Kenneth's mind reeled. They were thinking of selling the timber on private land to fund a public building. That's impossible, he said. They don't own the trees. But they can tax them, Maria said. And if they know exactly how much they're worth, they can tax them to the maximum legal limit. Or they can change the laws. Kenneth took the document to Susan Carter. She read it, her face hardening. This is beyond aggressive assessment, she said. This is asset mapping for appropriation. They're treating your trees like a public resource they haven't tapped yet. This is what I was afraid of. You didn't just win a case. You showed them where the money was. So what do I do? Kenneth asked, sue them again. You can't sue them for making a list, Susan said, but you can use it. This document proves their intent is revenue maximization, not fair assessment. We need to get it in front of people who can stop it. Kenneth made copies. He gave one to the local newspaper reporter who had covered his story. He gave one to a state representative who sat on the Agriculture Committee. He mailed one to the state attorney general's office. The reaction was not what he expected. The newspaper wrote a cautious story about county modernization efforts. The state representative's office sent a form letter thanking him for his concern. The attorney general's office did not respond. The system was too big, too insulated. A list of numbers in a spreadsheet wasn't a crime. It was just planning. Kenneth felt despair for the first time. He had fought the overt attack, the giant tax bill, the criminal threat, and won. But he couldn't fight the slow, bureaucratic absorption of his property into a government database as a revenue source. It was like trying to punch fog. Then Carl called. His voice was shaking. They denied my building permit, Ken. Carl had applied to build a small equipment shed on the edge of his woodlot, the one that had been reclassified. The county planning department had denied it. Reason: the proposed structure would impact a designated timber management area and could affect future harvest operations. But it's my land, Carl shouted over the phone. I can't build a shed on my own land because they've decided my primary crop is trees I might cut in 50 years. Kenneth understood instantly. The classification wasn't just about taxes anymore. It was about control. The county was using the T1 designation to restrict what landowners could do with their own property, all to protect the future timber revenue they hoped to tax. This was the escalation, from taxation to regulation, from taking a share to dictating use. Carl hired a land use attorney. The appeal was expensive and failed. The county's zoning code gave broad deference to protecting agricultural and timber resources. The shed was never built. The word spread through the farming community. The voluntary review program, which had seemed like a fair compromise, was now seen as a trap. Sign up, get the right tax rate, but lose the right to use your land. Landowners stopped coming forward. The program stalled. Ben Arneson's office responded by becoming more aggressive with the parcels already on their list. They began sending out timber management questionnaires. The letter asked detailed questions. When do you plan to harvest? What is your management plan? Who is your forester? Failure to return the questionnaire could result in a lack of management determination, potentially leading to the loss of the T1 classification and a jump to a much higher residential tax rate. It was a devil's bargain. Engage with them and give them control. Ignore them and face financial ruin. Kenneth received his questionnaire. He filled it out with David Shaw's help, stating a management plan of natural growth with selective harvest every 80 years. He listed David as his forester. He mailed it back. 2 weeks later, he received a response. The county did not accept natural growth as a valid management plan. They requested a detailed written plan from a certified forester, including projected harvest schedules, sustainable yield calculations, and reforestation strategies. They gave him 90 days to comply. The cost for such a plan was estimated at $5,000 to $10,000, and once filed, it would be a legally binding document. Deviating from it could be deemed a change of use, triggering penalties. They were trying to force him to turn his family woods into a commercial tree farm for their tax rolls. Kenneth refused. He wrote back, citing his settlement agreement, which guaranteed no penalties for current owners. The county replied that the agreement covered past taxes, not future compliance with lawful ordinances. The standoff was complete. The county had found a new lever, not the tax code but the zoning and forestry regulations. The goal was the same: maximize revenue by maximizing their control over the asset. Kenneth was back in a fight, but this time he had no clear legal weapon. The settlement was useless. He was facing a slow, bureaucratic squeeze designed to make him capitulate or sell. He made an appointment to see Ben Arneson in person. No lawyers, just 2 men. Ben's office was neat, impersonal. He did not offer coffee. Kenneth sat down. "Why are you doing this?" Kenneth asked. "You lost. The court made you settle. Why keep coming?" Ben folded his hands on the desk. "My job, Mr. Miller, is to ensure all property in this county is assessed fairly and according to its use. Your land is timberland. Timberland requires management. We are simply ensuring the use is legitimate." "This isn't about use," Kenneth said. "It's about money. You saw a cash register in the woods and you can't stand that you don't control the drawer." Ben's expression didn't change. The county provides services, schools, roads, law enforcement. Those services are paid for by property taxes. When a valuable asset is systematically underreported, everyone else pays more. My duty is to the taxpayers as a whole, not to one individual. Even if you destroy the individual in the process. "I haven't destroyed anyone," Ben said. "I've applied the law." Kenneth stood up. He knew there was nothing more to say. The system, in Ben Arneson, had found its perfect agent. A man who saw his duty as filling the county's coffers for the greater good, and who was willing to use every tool to do it. Moral ambiguity was a luxury he couldn't afford. As Kenneth reached the door, Ben spoke again. "You should get the management plan, Mr. Miller. It's the easiest path, or you could sell. With the timber value now documented, you get an excellent price. You could retire." Kenneth turned. "Sell to who?" "Developers," Ben said with a small shrug. "They'd pay a premium for land with mature hardwoods. They clear-cut it, build houses, and the county gets even higher taxes. It's a net win for the community." There it was, the final truth. The county didn't just want to tax his timber. If they couldn't control the harvest, they wanted him to sell to someone who would destroy it entirely, generating a one-time windfall and permanent higher tax base. The trees were worth more to them dead. Kenneth walked out. He drove not to his farm, but to his son Michael's house. Michael was in the garage, working on a planter. "They want me to sell," Kenneth said, leaning against the doorframe. Michael put down a wrench. "What did you say?" "I haven't said anything yet." "They can't make you sell, Dad." "No," Kenneth said, "but they can make keeping it so painful, so expensive, so tangled in rules that selling feels like the only freedom left. That's how they win. Not with a knockout punch, with 1,000 paper cuts." "So what's the answer?" Michael asked. Kenneth looked at his son, a man now, running the row crop side of the operation. "The answer isn't just to fight for my 80 acres, he said. "The answer is to break their model, to make the timber worth more to everyone standing than it is cut down or taxed into oblivion." "How do you do that?" "I don't know yet," Kenneth admitted, "but I know someone who might." He drove to the state university the next day, to the Department of Forestry. He asked for the extension agent he'd spoken to years before, a man named Dr. Eli Peterson. Eli remembered him. "You're the walnut man from St. Joseph," he said, smiling. "I followed your case. You caused quite a stir." "I need to cause a bigger one," Kenneth said. "They're trying to tax and regulate my woods out of existence. They want me to sell to developers. Is there any way to make a standing forest more valuable to the county than a subdivision?" Eli leaned back in his chair. "Financially, in pure tax revenue, no. A house on 1 acre will always generate more annual tax than an acre of trees, but value isn't just tax revenue. There's carbon sequestration, water filtration, biodiversity, ecosystem services." "The county doesn't get a check for that," Kenneth said. "Not yet," Eli said, "but they could. There are emerging markets, carbon credits, conservation easements, mitigation banking. The value is shifting from the board foot to the environmental service, but it's complicated. It takes years to set up." Kenneth felt a flicker of hope, an end run around the tax code. What if I could get my woods to generate income just for existing, for cleaning air, storing carbon, protecting a watershed? "Then the county's revenue argument falls apart," Eli said. "You'd have an income stream they can't tax as heavily, and a justification for keeping the land forested in perpetuity. It's the ultimate defense. You turn their weapon, the monetary value of the trees, into your shield." It was a distant, complex solution, but it was a path forward that didn't end in a chainsaw or a bulldozer. Kenneth returned home and called a meeting. He invited David Shaw, his forester. He invited Susan Carter, his attorney. And he invited Maria, the IT worker from the county. He laid out Eli Peterson's idea. "We need to pioneer this," he said, "for my land first. If we can make it work, we create a blueprint. We give every landowner on that county list a way out. We make the trees worth more alive to everyone than they are as logs or lots." The group was silent, considering the scale. "It will cost a fortune in studies and legal work," Susan said. "I have the timber money," Kenneth said. "Use it." "It could take 5 years before you see $1 from carbon credits," David added. "I have time," Kenneth said. "And the county will fight it," Maria said. "They'll say you're avoiding taxes, creating a fake business." "Let them," Kenneth said. "We'll do it by the book. The newest books will be so transparent it hurts. will turn my property into a public case study in new forestry economics. The plan was born. They would pursue a dual strategy. First, a conservation easement donated to a land trust, permanently protecting the woods from development and providing a large charitable tax deduction. Second, enrollment in a rigorous carbon offset program, quantifying the carbon stored by the mature hardwoods and selling those credits on a regulated market. The process was a maze of science, law, and finance. It required a forest carbon inventory, a legal deed restriction, a third-party verifier, a broker to sell the credits. It was the opposite of a quick timber sale. It was the long game. Kenneth committed. He spent $60,000 of his timber money on the initial work. The county, seeing the surveys and scientists on his land, inquired. He sent them a letter explaining his intent to place a permanent conservation easement on the property. The reaction was swift, a letter from the county commissioner's office. They urged him to reconsider, citing the loss of future tax revenue and the locking away of a vital economic resource. They requested a meeting. Kenneth agreed. He brought Dr. Eli Peterson with him. The meeting was tense. The commissioners argued that permanent conservation was against the public interest. That land should be available for future needs. Eli Peterson presented the numbers. The carbon credits over time would generate steady income. The easement would provide a large federal income tax deduction, keeping Kenneth's money in the local economy. The ecological benefits had measurable economic value in reduced water treatment costs, flood mitigation, and air quality. One commissioner, an older man named Briggs, was unmoved. "Trees you can't cut are just scenery," he said. "Scenery doesn't pay for police cars." Then Kenneth spoke. He hadn't planned to. "You're right, Commissioner Briggs. For 35 years, these trees were just scenery to you. You taxed them as wasteland. Now that you see they're a bank, you want a key to the vault. But they were never your bank. They were always mine. And I've decided to put my savings into a trust where they'll grow a different kind of interest. An interest that doesn't end with a stump." The meeting ended without resolution, but the county's power was checked. They couldn't stop a legal conservation process. They could only complain. The work proceeded. The carbon inventory was completed. The easement was drafted. The process was public, written about in forestry journals and even a national magazine about land conservation. Kenneth Miller, the farmer who fought the county over his tax bill, was becoming a poster child for a new movement, the working forest conservationist. The county's timber parcel inventory lost its menace. For the other landowners on the list, Kenneth had created an escape route. Several approached him to learn about the process. The county's leverage, the threat of punitive taxation and regulation, evaporated if the landowner chose a path that was both ecologically noble and financially smart. Ben Arneson resigned from the assessor's office 6 months later. He took a job in the private sector with a firm that appraised commercial real estate. His departure memo cited a desire for new challenges. The system's most dedicated agent was gone. The machine slowed. On a bright October morning, Kenneth walked his property with his grandson, a boy of 10. They stopped at the stump of the first walnut, now moss-covered. "What happened here, Grandpa?" the boy asked. "That's where the fight started," Kenneth said, "and where we learned how to win a different way." He looked at the dense canopy, the straight trunks, the forest that was now permanently his and permanently its own. The tax bill was higher but fair. The rules were clearer, and the value was no longer a secret between him and the county. It was a fact in the world, measured in tons of carbon, in protected habitat, in legacy. He had forced them to see the trees not as a crop, or a tax base, or a building lot, but as a capital asset of a different kind. The fight had cost him over half his timber harvest money in legal fees, appraisals, and the new conservation work. He was poorer in cash. But he was richer in land, in security. and in the knowledge that he had not just saved his woods, but had changed the rules of the game for everyone who came after. The war was over, not with a surrender but with a transformation. The wasteland was now a sanctuary, and its value was finally measured correctly, not by the board foot but by the century. The conservation easement was recorded in the St. Joseph County Courthouse on a Tuesday morning in May. Kenneth Miller did not attend. He was on his farm, watching a team from the land trust install a small, permanent sign at the edge of the woods. It read, "Miller Family Woods Protected in Perpetuity." The legal document was 32 pages long. It extinguished the development rights forever. The land could never be subdivided, cleared for housing, or used for anything other than forestry, recreation, and agriculture. In return, Kenneth received a federal charitable tax deduction worth $1.2 million to be spread over several years. The carbon credit contract was signed the following week. A California-based tech company seeking to offset its emissions agreed to purchase the verified carbon credits from Kenneth's forest for 12 years. The upfront payment was $85,000. Annual payments would follow. The trees now had a job, standing still and breathing. Let me tell you about the first property tax bill Kenneth received after all this was in place, because it's the final number in the equation. It arrived in November. The classification was still T1, managed timberland. The assessed value was now $105,000, a slight increase from the $96,000 after his state appeal, reflecting updated soil tables. The annual tax was $1,470. Kenneth opened it at the same kitchen table where he'd opened the $34,000 bill years before. He showed it to his wife, Ellen. $1,470, she read. "We can live with that." He could. It was 13 times more than his original bill, but it was fair. It was based on the land's real capacity, not on punishment or greed. He wrote the check. The fight was financially quantified. The $390,000 timber harvest had been whittled down. Legal fees, $128,000. Appraisal and consulting fees, $65,000. The conservation planning and carbon verification work, $70,000. He had roughly $127,000 left, plus the future carbon payments, plus the massive tax deduction. He was not a rich man from the harvest, but he was a secure man. His land was safe. His legacy was locked in. Now let me tell you about the ripple effect, because Kenneth's case didn't just change his 80 acres. It changed the calculus for every woodland owner in St. Joseph County. The county's timber parcel inventory, that secret list of valuable woodlots, was leaked to the local newspaper 6 months after Kenneth's easement was recorded. The newspaper published an interactive map online. Landowners could look up their own parcels and see the county's estimated timber value. Panic turned to strategy. Dozens of landowners, now armed with information about their own hidden asset, did not run to the assessor. They ran to foresters and conservation groups. A local land trust reported a 300% increase in inquiries about conservation easements for woodlots. The county's plan to systematically reclassify and maximize revenue from these parcels collapsed. They had created a map, and the map's subjects used it to defend themselves. The voluntary review program was quietly ended. The new county assessor, a woman named Lisa Cho, publicly stated her office would focus on collaborative classification and emphasized existing conservation programs. Ben Arneson's model of aggressive revenue hunting was officially dead. Carl, Kenneth's neighbor, followed a different path. He didn't want a permanent easement. He sold his 30-acre woodlot, but not to a developer. He sold it to a neighboring farmer who wanted to add it to his own conserved forest block. The sale price was $220,000, far more than the $90,000 he got for his timber harvest. The new owner placed an easement on it the following year. Carl used the money to pay off debt on his row crop operation. He still complains about taxes, but he smiles when he says it. The story entered local lore. At the diner at the co-op, you'd hear references to pulling a Miller. It meant knowing the value of what you had and using every tool, legal, financial, environmental, to protect it from those who saw it only as a commodity. It was a term of respect. 5 years after the easement was signed, Kenneth received a letter from the St. Joseph County Board of Commissioners. It was an invitation. The county was creating an advisory board for natural resource and agricultural assessment policies. They wanted Kenneth to serve as the forest landowner representative. Ellen read the letter over his shoulder. After everything, they want your help. Kenneth didn't answer right away. He thought about Ben Arneson's cold office. He thought about the prosecutor's meeting. He thought about the fear. Then he thought about the sign at the edge of his woods. He accepted. The first meeting was in the same county building where he'd faced the Board of Review years before. He sat at the table with other farmers, a forester, an ecologist, and the new assessor, Lisa Cho. The topic was how to properly classify mixed-use properties with woodlots. Lisa Cho turned to him. "Mr. Miller, based on your experience, what would a fair and clear process look like?" Kenneth had prepared. He laid out a simple proposal, a one-page form. A landowner declares their primary use. If they declare timber, they submit a basic management statement, a paragraph, not a $10,000 plan. The county then uses the standard soil-based valuation. No penalties for natural growth. No automatic referrals to other agencies. A 5-year review cycle, not constant scrutiny. The forester on the board nodded. "That's actually sensible," he said. "It's what the state guidelines suggest, but nobody ever implements them that way." The proposal was drafted into a county ordinance. It passed unanimously. The Miller form became the standard. It was simple, clear, and removed the fear. Landowners began declaring their timber accurately. The county's roles became more accurate. The confrontations ended. Kenneth had done it. He had not just beaten the system, he had helped rebuild it into something that worked. Let me tell you about the final visit. 2 years ago, a graduate student from the state university wrote to Kenneth. She was studying the impact of conserved forest fragments on migratory bird populations. She asked if she could conduct research on his property. Kenneth agreed. She and 2 other students spent a spring and summer tagging birds, taking notes and mapping habitats. At the end of the summer, she came to Kenneth's house with her report. She was excited. "Mr. Miller," she said, "your woodlot is a significant stopover site for the cerulean warbler. It's a species of special concern. Their population has dropped by 70%. Your forest, because of its age and mix of hardwoods, provides perfect canopy foraging habitat. We counted more breeding pairs here than in any other private woodlot in the county." Kenneth listened. He knew birds lived in his woods, but he didn't know their names or their struggles. The student handed him a bound copy of her thesis. "There's a chapter on your property," she said. "It's called The Accidental Sanctuary." Kenneth read it that night. The scientific language was dense, but the meaning was clear. His woods, which the county had called Wasteland, were a vital refuge for a disappearing piece of the world. Their value, which he had fought over in terms of board feet and tax dollars, was now being measured in warblers saved. That was the final surprise. The hidden fortune was not just in the walnut, it was in the canopy. The fight to define value had started with veneer logs and ended with endangered birds. The money was important, but it was the smallest part of the story. Kenneth Miller is now in his late 70s. He still walks the woods. The sign is there, faintly green with lichen. The stump of the first walnut is almost gone, reclaimed by the forest. His son, Michael, manages the row crops. His grandson, the one who asked about the stump, is in college studying environmental science. He wants to be a forester. The county's property tax system works. The fear is gone. The map is public. The rules are clear. The filing cabinet in Kenneth's home office contains the entire history. The original C3 tax notices, the shocking reassessment, the legal briefs, the settlement agreement, the carbon contract, the conservation easement, and the thesis on the cerulean warbler. He keeps it all not for nostalgia but as proof. Proof that a person can push back against a faceless system. Proof that value is what you defend, not just what you extract. Proof that sometimes you have to spend a fortune to save what's priceless. Let me leave you with this. Last fall, Kenneth was driving home from town. He passed the old county administrative building. He saw a man walking to his car carrying a briefcase. The man was in his 40s, wearing khakis and a county shirt. It was a new appraiser, someone Kenneth didn't know. The man saw Kenneth's truck, recognized him, and gave a small, respectful nod. Not a smile, not a frown, a nod of acknowledgement, the kind you give to someone who changed the landscape you both work in. Kenneth nodded back, and he drove on past the fields and the woodlots, home to his own piece of the map, his own calculated, protected, and thriving piece of the world. The wasteland was gone. In its place was a forest that had outlasted the assumptions, the greed, and the fear. It was just a woods again, but now everyone knew what it was worth. So what is the lesson in the trees? It's not a story about cheating the system. Kenneth Miller paid every tax bill the county ever sent him, on time. It's a story about a system that failed to see value until that value became a threat. For 35 years, the bureaucracy saw a green blob on a map and checked the wasteland box because it was the easiest path. It took a man cashing a check for his own timber to make them look closer. And when they looked, they didn't see a forest. They saw a budget line item. They saw a revenue stream they hadn't tapped. Their failure of vision was replaced not by understanding, but by appetite. Kenneth's fight was to correct that vision, to force the system to see his land for what it was, not for what it could be taxed as, or developed into, or liquidated for. He won that fight not with a bigger lawyer, but with a better idea of value. He redefined the wealth of his woods from something you measure after the chainsaw to something you measure while the tree still stands. This pattern repeats everywhere. The system defaults to the simple, the categorical, the easy to process. Your property is a square footage and a zip code. Your business is a revenue number. Your idea is a patent category. The fine print, the true potential, the hidden mature growth, these require effort to see. And most systems are designed to avoid effort. Until someone proves the cost of that blindness. Kenneth proved it. He proved that an 80-acre woodlot taxed at $8,000 could hold $2 million in timber. He proved that the same woodlot could be more valuable as a carbon sink and a bird sanctuary. He proved that a man who reads the manual, who gets the appraisal, who fights the appeal, can change not just his own assessment, but the assessment manual itself. The question this leaves us with is not about timber. It's about attention. What else is sitting in plain sight, consistently undervalued by the systems meant to measure it? What in your world is classified as a C3 wasteland because nobody has taken the time to walk the property with a forester's eye? It might be a skill the market hasn't priced yet. It might be data you own that others would pay for. It might be a patch of land behind your house, or a collection in your attic, or an idea in a notebook. The value isn't created by the system. The value exists. The system just hasn't caught up. Kenneth Miller's story is a blueprint. First, know what you have. Not a guess, not a hope, a professional appraisal. Second, understand the rules that govern its valuation. Not the common knowledge, the actual code. Third, be prepared to defend that valuation against a system that prefers simple defaults. And fourth, always have a better idea of what value means, one that outlasts the system's current appetite. His woods are still there. They'll be there in another 100 years doing the same work, growing, filtering, sheltering, storing. The tax bills will come and go. The assessors will change. The laws will be rewritten. The trees only have to stand their ground. That's the final victory. Not a payout, but a permanence. Not just winning the argument, but changing the terms of the argument for everyone who comes next. If you found this story revealing, consider subscribing. We find and explain the hidden patterns in the systems around us every week. Stay curious.